In 1998, film critic Roger Ebert sat down to review Lucio Fulci's The Beyond. The opening of his review said this: "The plot involves," excuse me for a moment while I laugh uncontrollably at having written the words, "the plot involves." Ebert wasn't joking. He genuinely believed The Beyond was a failure, a movie that couldn't execute basic storytelling. He called it nonsensical trash, a film that made no sense and cared even less about trying to make sense. But here's what Ebert fundamentally misunderstood. The Beyond isn't a failure of filmmaking. It's a radical artistic choice. Fulci didn't accidentally make a plotless film. He deliberately weaponized narrative incoherence as a tool for horror. And by the time the end credits roll, when your protagonists are wandering a surreal landscape of corpses with no hope of escape, you realize that lack of logic isn't a flaw. It's the entire point. Today, we'll discuss how one Italian director figured out something that most mainstream horror films never discover. Sometimes the most effective horror is precisely the horror that refuses to be understood. This is the story of the cosmic horror classic, The Beyond. The critical response to The Beyond split almost immediately along a very clear line: mainstream critics versus film scholars. And understanding this divide is essential to understanding what Fulci actually accomplished with this film. On one side, you had voices like Roger Ebert, representing conventional film criticism. His position was clear. Horror films, like all films, required coherent plotting and logical character motivation. Without these elements, they were simply failures. A contemporary review of the film in the Akron Beacon Journal articulated this perfectly. "We never know why they get killed or why they get ugly," which leads me to suspect that maybe this is an art film. That reviewer was being sarcastic, but the implication was clear. If you don't understand it, it must be pretentious nonsense or just trash. This critical framework dominated for years. The Beyond was dismissed as unfinished, incompetent, or deliberately obscure in a way mainstream critics found contemptible. And to be fair, you can make the case that some of the film's narrative challenges are based on questionable continuity, a lack of budget, and Italian filmmakers not entirely understanding American culture. But there's definitely more happening in this film, and the vast majority of it was absolutely intentional. Anyway, while mainstream critics were complaining, a different conversation was happening in academic film circles. Film scholar Wheeler Winston Dixon identified something in The Beyond that mainstream critics completely missed. He argued that Fulci created a strangely dreamlike, hyper-violent abandonment of narrative that produces the sensation of a waking nightmare from which you never fully emerge. Dixon was not apologizing for the film's incoherence. He wasn't excusing it or trying to defend it as a flawed effort. He was celebrating it as an intentional artistic strategy. This whole argument represented a fundamental philosophical disagreement about what horror cinema should do. Ebert and mainstream critics seemed to believe that plot coherence and logical character motivation were non-negotiable, the foundation upon which all other filmmaking elements were built. Dixon and horror film scholars believed that horror, perhaps more than any other genre, could abandon those conventions entirely and create something more viscerally effective by doing so. The Beyond forced this question into the open, and the film's inability to fit into either critical camp created an impasse that lasted for decades. But it also revealed something crucial. Maybe the real issue wasn't whether the film was good or bad by conventional standards. Maybe the issue was whether we were even asking the right questions about what horror cinema could accomplish. Most horror films use setting as backdrop. The Beyond uses it as a narrative structure itself. The Seven Doors Hotel isn't just where the story takes place, it's the organizing principle that holds everything together. Without it, The Beyond would be genuinely incomprehensible. With it, you realize the hotel is actually the main character. Everything that happens occurs because of the hotel's existence and its supernatural properties.
Because according to the Book of Ebert, this hotel is one of the 7 gateways of hell.
Liza Merrill arrives to claim her inherited property and begins renovation work. Almost immediately, death starts happening. Not in a traditional haunted house progression, though. The violence doesn't follow from character choices or personal grudges. Rather, the hotel generates death through its architectural spaces. The cellar, room 36, the flooded corridors, and even the hospital that later becomes an extension of the same cursed geography. Fulci structures scenes in a specific way. Characters are introduced to a space, they interact with that space, and then violence emerges from the space itself. The violence doesn't really follow from their actions. It doesn't emerge from a vengeful ghost's clear motivation. Instead, it just happens, because they're in the hotel, and the membrane between the waking world and what lies beyond is breaking down. This is crucial for understanding narrative incoherence. By using the hotel as the organizing principle rather than conventional plot mechanics, Fulci creates a structure where cause and effect becomes irrelevant. The space itself becomes the causal agent, and in a space that exists as a gateway to hell, described in an ancient grimoire called the Book of Ebert, logical narrative would actually be inappropriate.
In this book are collected all the prophecies of Ebert, handed down from generation to generation, over more than 4,000 years.
For viewers interested in weird fiction, the Book of Ebert is a significant reference. It's actually a creation of author Clark Ashton Smith, later incorporated by H.P. Lovecraft into his own mythos stories. Fulci's choice to reference the Book of Ebert signals something important. The Beyond isn't operating as naturalistic horror. It's operating in cosmic horror territory instead. The events aren't explained by ghosts or psychology. They're explained by proximity to something genuinely alien and incomprehensible. A literal gateway to a realm that exists, as screenwriter Darno Sacchetti explicitly states, outside Euclidean geometry. When characters encounter something truly cosmic, something genuinely beyond human comprehension, logical narrative would actually be inappropriate. How would you tell a coherent story about encountering the incomprehensible? You wouldn't, and you really probably couldn't, and that's exactly what Fulci and Sacchetti understand. The film opens with 7 minutes set back in 1927. The scene is shot in sepia tones, depicting the brutal torture and murder of an artist named Schweik. Then it abruptly cuts to 1981 in full color, with new characters and no direct narrative connection. For viewers unfamiliar with Fulci's methods, this seems jarring, almost unfinished. But it's really neither of those things. The prologue isn't a failure. In fact, it's crucial. It establishes a visual and thematic vocabulary without requiring plot explanation. We don't need to understand why Schweik is being tortured here. We don't need detailed motivation for the mob's violence. We just need to experience the brutality, the atmosphere, and the sense that some ancient evil is being violently suppressed, and in the process, unleashed. Screenwriter Darno Sacchetti explained Fulci's approach by saying that the hotel and characters were essentially pretexts, and what really mattered was weaving a fabric of pure emotion. The prologue demonstrates this perfectly. Its primary function isn't to explain plot, it's to establish mood, tone, and visual aesthetic. The set piece becomes one of the most famous torture sequences in horror cinema. Schweik is dragged to the cellar by a lynch mob, and what follows is several minutes of sustained, detailed violence. Fulci doesn't frame this as campy fun, he frames it as visual art. Cinematographer Sergio Salvati shoots the torture with a painter's eye, the sepia palette, the strong silhouettes, and carefully composed close-ups that feel like engravings come to life. Schweik is whipped with chains, nailed to the wall, and doused in quicklime that slowly burns his face away. His flesh slides off, his features dissolve, and yet his eyes stay open almost the entire time. It is at once repulsive and sort of oddly hypnotically beautiful. That tension between formal beauty and graphic violence becomes the film's signature aesthetic. It's brutal surrealism presented with the care of an art film. And of course the eyes matter. Fulci and Sacchetti are famous for eye trauma, but here the eyes aren't merely objects of gore. They symbolize the curse of perception, the horror of seeing too much, of being forced to witness things that cannot be unseen. Throughout the film, blindness and damaged eyes recur as signs that exposure to the beyond has literally burned out the ability to see normal reality. When the film jumps to 1981, that theme of perception and incomprehension carries straight into the present-day storyline. Liza arrives at the hotel and consults with architect Martin Avery about renovating the crumbling property. As work begins, a painter on scaffolding falls to his death. In a conventional horror film, this character might survive long enough to explain what he saw. Here, he barely manages a fragmented warning about eyes watching him before dying on the couch.
The eyes! Her eyes!
The next major death pushes the logic even further. Joe the plumber is called to investigate a leak in the cellar. He descends into a basement that looks less like Louisiana and more like an infernal grotto. Wet stone, unnatural lighting, and a sense that time is thickening around him. As he probes the wall, a decayed hand emerges and stabs him in the eye. Why is Schweik's corpse in the wall somehow alive again? Why does it attack now? The film never clearly tells you. Instead, it forces you to watch an inexplicable, protracted death scene that obeys no clear narrative rule. The point here is not about explanation. The point is to confront you with horror that simply is. After these deaths, Liza encounters a blind woman named Emily, standing improbably on a causeway with her dog. Emily seems to know things she shouldn't.
Woe be unto him who opens one of the 7 gateways to hell. Because through that gateway, evil will invade the world.
She warns Liza to abandon the hotel, talks cryptically about the book and the 7 gateways, and moves with an eerie, almost spectral grace. Later, when Dr. McCabe tries to confirm her existence, the house where she supposedly lives is empty, dust-covered, and apparently long abandoned. What Emily is never clearly stated. Is she a ghost, a psychic medium, a damned soul trying to save others from her fate? The film never really nails it down. She functions as a thematic presence, not a plot device. She appears and heightens the sense that something is fundamentally wrong with reality and then vanishes back into the haze. By the end of this first act, Fulci has made his method unmistakable. Introduce characters, subject them to horrifying events, refuse to explain, and move on. There are no neat character arcs or tidy closures. What emerges instead is an escalating feeling that the world of the film is slipping out of the grasp of cause and effect altogether. One of the strongest clues to how The Beyond should be read lies in its treatment of time. The film's temporal logic frays almost immediately. A character dies, is autopsied, and is buried in what feels like the span of an afternoon errand, prompting at least one critic to point out that events unfold in ways that are impossible if taken literally. That sort of time compression might be simple sloppiness in another movie, but in The Beyond it happens repeatedly and always in moments tied to the supernatural. Time stretches, snaps, and seemingly folds in on itself. Scenes that should take days seem to happen in hours. Corpses reappear as if death were just a minor inconvenience. Liza and Dr. McCabe attempt to escape the hotel's influence by going to the hospital. But once there, they discover that the same irrational forces are working here too. Corridors are empty, and the dead rise from slabs and beds with no explanation beyond the suggestion that the barrier between worlds has thinned to nothing. The hospital and the library, in other words, are not a fresh start. They're just the hotel by another name, another mask worn by the same nightmare. That suggests one of two possibilities. Either the curse is spread outward, infecting the broader world, or Liza and McCabe are already in a liminal state. Dead, dreaming, or trapped in a purgatorial loop where locations are expressions of their condition rather than fixed places. The film pointedly refuses to confirm which of these is true, though. This ambiguity crystallizes in the film's climax. Fleeing through the hospital's basement, the protagonists pass through a doorway and emerge not into a familiar street, but into the Sea of Darkness, a vast, ash-colored wasteland strewn with corpses. A disembodied line explains that they've crossed into a realm outside of Euclidean geometry, where ordinary concepts of space no longer apply. To be outside of that is to be in a place where the basic assumptions of reality have broken down. And if space has become non-Euclidean, then narrative, which depends on stable space and time, necessarily breaks down too. Fulci more or less admits this was the goal. He described The Beyond as an absolute horror film, plotless and structured as a series of images and sensations rather than a story in the traditional sense. He also spoke about life as a kind of terrible nightmare, and about the idea of existing outside time as the only refuge from that nightmare. That isn't just a throwaway line, it's a worldview that explains exactly why this film feels like a fever dream that you can't wake up from. In conventional horror, tension is built on recognizable rules. Characters act, consequences follow. You learn how the monster works, what triggers attacks, what might lead to survival. Even when the rules are supernatural, there's still rules. That familiarity gives audiences a strange kind of comfort even as they're being scared. The Beyond rips that safety net away. Take Martin Avery's death in the library. He goes to consult plans and records like a rational protagonist in a haunted house narrative. Then, with absolutely no build-up, he's shoved from the ladder by an unseen force, lies paralyzed on the floor, and is slowly eaten alive by tarantulas that seem to materialize from nowhere. There's no clear symbolic logic tying architect plus hotel plans to tarantula attack. The film refuses to supply even a flimsy rationale for this, and that refusal is key. Because there are no consistent rules, you can't predict what kind of horror is coming next, or when, or why. You're denied the ability to map cause to effect. The result is a very specific kind of anxiety, the fear that reality itself no longer behaves in comprehensible ways. Here, the contrast with Dario Argento is instructive. Argento's jolly and supernatural films, however baroque, are still built around mysteries that can be pieced together. Violence in his work often has a secret logic waiting to be uncovered. Fulci, especially in The Beyond, isn't interested in solving anything. Visually, Sergio Salvati's cinematography makes this philosophical stance tangible. The sepia-toned prologue has the coherence of an old photograph. Present-day hotel interiors are shot in cool, drifting tones that suddenly give way to lurid reds and cool blues in the basement and morgue. By the time you reach the Sea of Darkness, the image is almost bleached of color, like reality has been drained away. Each major shift in palette corresponds to a deeper step into irrational space. Fabio Frizzi's score works in parallel. Rather than underlining jump scares, it sits on top of the film like a fog, repeating motifs, unresolved progressions, and droning textures that don't care whether a scene is supposed to be quiet or intense. At other times, Fulci drops the music entirely and lets you sit in dry, suffocating silence, listening to footsteps, echoing corridors, and the soft sound of things moving just out of frame. The effect is disorienting. Your usual cues for when to feel scared have been completely scrambled. What makes The Beyond even more fascinating is that the chaos wasn't just a happy accident of a messy production. There is strong evidence that the looseness was part of the design. Fulci reportedly worked from a very short treatment, only a few pages outlining the main beats rather than a detailed script. Now, we should note here that there's a lot of conjecture about this. Sacchetti wrote a 26-page treatment, and there's an actual 162-page script for The Beyond filed in Italy dated 1980 with Sacchetti's name on it. Fulci and screenwriter Giorgio Mariuzzo also contributed, but the story Fulci tells is that he mostly filmed from that very short treatment. Fulci wasn't always the most reliable of narrators, but let's just assume this is mostly correct. Producer Fabrizio De Angelis, fresh off the commercial success of Zombie 2, wanted to push further into stranger, more atmospheric territory instead of repeating the same horror formula. Fulci, Sacchetti, and cinematographer Sergio Salvati therefore built much of the film's visual and narrative texture on set, responding to locations, weather, and improvisation. This does not mean that every continuity error is carefully premeditated, but it does mean the team embraced a method where mood and imagery could override strict logic. They were, in a sense, making a nightmare using the grammar of cinema, and accepting that nightmares don't come with tidy blueprints. The Beyond sits in the middle of what's often called Fulci's Gates of Hell cycle, alongside City of the Living Dead and The House by the Cemetery. Of the three, House by the Cemetery is the most conventionally structured, while City and The Beyond lean hardest into what critics sometimes call nightmare logic. Seen in that context, The Beyond feels like Fulci taking everything he'd been inching toward and pushing it to an extreme. A film where the gate to hell isn't just a plot device, but a governing principle for how the movie itself operates, how it handles time, space, image, and causality. For a long time, though, that ambition went largely unrecognized. Outside of horror fandom, The Beyond remained a punchline, or at best, a guilty pleasure. That started to change in the late 1990s when Quentin Tarantino helped arrange a new US theatrical run under his Rolling Thunder imprint. That re-release introduced the movie to a new generation, and implicitly framed it as something worth taking seriously. Since then, The Beyond has been steadily reclaimed as a major work of European horror. It appears on lists of essential genre films, is discussed in academic writing on surrealism and horror, and is cited as an influence by contemporary directors working in art horror and dream logic cinema. Fulci himself was blunt about what he thought he'd done. He contrasted conventional films, which in his words, any idiot can understand, with what he called absolute films like The Beyond and Argento's Inferno, works meant to be experienced as image, sound, and mood rather than decoded as neat stories. He also insisted that viewers needed to let go of narrative expectations and allow the film to wash over them, the way one might approach a surrealist painting. That, ultimately, is the key. The Beyond isn't trying to scare you with monster rules, plot twists, or puzzle box storytelling. It's trying to trap you in a feeling, the sense that reality has slipped just out of your conceptual reach and is now operating according to laws you'll never fully grasp. The film's narrative incoherence isn't an obstacle to be explained away. It's the engine that drives the horror. The film ends as it must, with Liza and Dr. McCabe blind and lost in the Sea of Darkness, frozen in an eternal tableau of defeat. There is no explanation, no rescue, no revelation that makes anything make sense. There's only the awful realization that this is it, that they and we have passed beyond the point where understanding is possible. When critics complained that The Beyond made no sense, they were absolutely right. And that was exactly what made it brilliant. Ready to perform another cinematic postmortem on a strange and haunting film? Then be sure to check out my video on Calvaire. You'll find a link here on the screen. I hope to see you over there.
I've already told you I don't have the money. Do whatever you want to do as long as it doesn't cost.
I have carte blanche?
Carte blanche, but not a blank check,